So I'm going to stop the slide sharing, turn this back to Chris. Chris, if you want to share screen, maybe you can share some of your research and knowledge on banyans and maybe a starting point. What's the difference between a banyan and a dressing gown, or others might call it a morning gown?
So I have rapidly just thrown together a few images that I've got on saved on my computer. I just threw them all together in one big folder. I hope we can see that. Um, to begin to answer your question, this is one of the things that I was hoping to chat with Zack about. And really, my knowledge of this comes from the wonderful people at the World of Colonial Williamsburg. If you have not visited there, you should absolutely visit, and especially stop in to the tailor shop. I know Zack has made some friends there. I had the pleasure just before the world shut down of traveling there in early 2020 and talking to Mike McCarthy, who is at that point was an apprentice tailor, and I believe now is a journeyman tailor. And he has just a fantastic wealth of knowledge, as do all the people at Colonial Williamsburg. And this was the first time I was really introduced to the term banyan versus morning gown or dressing gown. There's sort of a variety of different words that are sort of adjectives that are used before the word gown. And Mike really pointed out that in a lot of the advertisements, now he's working from the late 18th century as opposed to the Regency, which is where we tend to be. Mike was really pointing out that a lot of the advertisements in the late 18th century in the US and in Europe would refer to selling both banyans and morning gowns or banyans and dressing gowns, suggesting to him that, or to everybody, that they're two distinct garments. Right? If they were the same garment, why would we be selling two different names? So their conjecture, their theory, and I'm going to just double check my notes because I get these mixed up all the time. So their theory is that these actually were two different garments, and they have evolved from two very different sources. And so one, the morning gown is a much looser flowing garment. I'm going to see if I have a picture here. Sorry, I can't. I'm having trouble previewing my pictures with while I'm on Zoom. But it's a much looser flowing garment. We tend to think of it as sort of the more traditional banyan, I would say. It almost looks like a more modern or wrapping gown. And then we have the garment. So let me start again, make sure I'm getting these right. So the looser flowing garment we would call the morning gown or the wrapping gown, and the more fitted garment, like similar to what you see on the screen here, is the banyan. And so you can see that it buttons down the front. The sleeves are cut a little bit closer. It's a little bit more fitted.
Chris,
Yeah, sorry.
I don't know if you have opened an image. All I'm seeing are the thumbnails.
Oh,
So
okay.
then maybe try going on the share screen button, and then maybe you have to share the larger image.
That is perhaps what I'm doing. Okay, let me try again. Sorry about that. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So this is the more fitted garment. You can see the sleeves are a little bit more fitted. You can see it buttons down the front. Now that's not to say that a looser fitting garment wouldn't have some sort of closure, but it's designed to be a little bit closer fitting. So one of the things I was hoping to talk to Zack about was the difference between these two garments and when we see them come in, and even especially as we travel from the sort of third quarter of the 18th century, that is the focus of Colonial Williamsburg, into the Regency, which technically started in 1811. which one of these two garments would have been more prevalent? Which one would we have seen more commonly? And my contention would be that we would probably see the banyan, the more fitted garment, more commonly into the Regency area, into the early 19th century, as opposed to the looser fitted gown, which tended to be more common in the 18th century. Certainly, clothing became more fitted. We have this vision of Beau Brummel and his clothing being very close fitting in the early 19th century. So that's a little bit where my contention comes from, but it would be entirely conjecture on my part. So I'm hoping Zach can fill that in a little bit. So that was one of the things I wanted to talk to Zach about, was the sort of the difference between those two gowns. And the other I was hoping to talk to him about was this idea that it was simply a dressing gown as we would know that term today. So whether you're talking about a banyan or a morning gown, there's this idea in today's society that it really is, it's almost like a house coat, right? So maybe you put on a house coat over your pajamas, for working in the morning, or when you first get up, or you're eating breakfast. But nobody's going to go out in public like that. Nobody's going to receive guests in a garment like that. But that's really not true. And one of the best pieces of evidence we have is that people regularly were painted in portraits wearing banyans. And so you can imagine nobody's going to go to Sears today in their house coat to get their family portrait done. So it can't be the same style of garment. It must have been certainly more acceptable outside in public. And I believe, again, Mike at Colonial Williamsburg talks about in the late 18th century, there are stories of I think college professors and sort of older university students complaining about younger university students wearing banyans to class. So again, it's not a house coat, right? It's not something that you're just going to wear in the morning, and then once you're ready to go outside, you put on a formal garment. But that being said, to me, it's not entirely clear on where the line is. What is socially acceptable? Nobody's going to go to a ball or the theater in their banyan. So where is the line on acceptable wear for a banyan or a morning gown? And I guess sort of stemming from that, is there a difference between a banyan and a morning gown? If we accept that a banyan is a more fitted garment, it's almost got some tailoring to it. Is it more socially acceptable to be worn at different times of the day? Is it socially acceptable to receive guests in your home in a banyan, but not a morning gown? So again, things that I'm hoping to talk to Zach about. Tom, I'm just gonna pop in and make sure you can see. I changed the picture. Make sure you can see that changed.
Yes, what I see right now is the portrait.
Excellent.
All right, and then hey, well, I turned my mic on. We have a question here. So, Western Pennsylvania was the frontier in late 1700s, early 1800s. Small middle class, would they have worn banyans?
That's a fantastic question, and I will maybe something I would say certainly out of my area of knowledge, and I don't want to put words in Zach's mouth, but I wonder if America would be out of his purview as well. But that's a wonderful question, and I wonder if certainly I know that the tailors of Williamsburg are very active on social media. I've seen them on Twitter in the past, or whatever it's called now. And so I wonder about reaching out to them. I'm afraid that sort of how far things extend into the US or even Canada, I'm not really sure. They would certainly be seen in the big centers, Boston, New York, York, Halifax. But how far they would extend to the frontier is a fantastic question. Now, piggybacking off that, it was certainly something that is not reserved for simply the very top tier of society. Banyans and morning gowns can be made in a variety of different materials. A lot of the ones you see are silks, but they can certainly be made in wool or cotton. And again, on the frontier, I mean, Western Pennsylvania isn't, entirely the frontier, right? But as you go further from sort of the major eastern East Coast centers, still a garment that could be worn around the home for warmth, right? There are examples. I don't think I have any here. Maybe I do. That were padded for warmth. You think about certainly in North America, just a wood fire heating the house. So it could be certainly things like that could be, I would imagine, would be seen in smaller centers. And I just wanted to put this picture up because I think it's three incredible versions of a banyan. I believe these are all in the collection of Williamsburg as well. And you can see a variety of fabrics. And it's very interesting, the banyan. We have this vision of the Regency era as very muted fabrics, very muted colors. Beau Brummel was said to like, white and buff small clothes and dark tailcoats, black, dark blue, dark green. But banyans were very much an opportunity to show a little bit more color. Really, really vivid silks and bright floral prints. And now these ones are 18th century examples, but that certainly lasted into the 19th century.
So, Chris, I'm got to admit I've been distracted answering emails and juggling various things here, but the banyan reflected fashion norms, right? It was if you weren't wearing a coat, you were considered undressed, or similar to be like walking around in your boxers or jockeys today, like in your underwear. So rather than a heavy wool coat, then a banyan or a dressing gown would suffice as an alternative.
Yeah, so that's what I was sort of saying is I'm not 100% clear on where the line is drawn. So it's very clear from people being painted in their portraits and these stories of people being seen in public in banyans that they were acceptable for being out in public. But as I was saying, you would never go to a ball, you would never go to the theater or a dinner in a banyan or a morning gown. So I'm not clear on when it stops being acceptable. I mean, it may be, once you get dressed for dinner, right? That's the hard line, right? You would never wear it for dinner.
Well, if I'm drawing parallels, I would come home from work, shed my suit, and put on a t-shirt and a pair of jogging shorts, where in this time period, someone would take off their heavy wool coat and then put a banyan on at home, so they're still properly dressed. And then I'm not sure if you're watching the live chat. Kay posted an interesting story. The ambassador of England came to present himself to President Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson opened the White House door himself, and he was wearing a banyan or dressing gown. So
fascinating. Actually, Tom, your analogy, I relied very heavily on Mike McCarthy because this is where a lot of my conversation began. But I believe he was the one that said to me, rather than thinking of a banyan as a house coat like we would wear today, he said maybe think of it more like a cardigan. So I don't work in an office, but I imagine people who do, maybe they go to the office, maybe even they loosen their tie a little bit, they take off their jacket when they're working, and they throw on a cardigan. And that's certainly acceptable for working in the office. It's certainly acceptable for being seen in public. But if you're going to have a meeting with the investors, or you're going to go to dinner, at a fancy restaurant, or you're going to go to the theater, you're going to tighten your tie and put your jacket back on. So it's not that you can't be seen in it; it's just not sort of the height of formality. And maybe even, certainly it's not unreasonable to welcome visitors into your home wearing a cardigan. But if you're greeting the ambassador to England, I would suggest maybe putting your dinner jacket back on, or tightening your tie and replacing the cardigan. So I wonder if that's a more sort of apt analogy that we should be sort of thinking about this. I'm just trying to keep an eye on my phone and see if I can see any updates.
Yeah, I like that analogy. That's probably better than a t-shirt and jogging shorts. Fits a little better. I'm also watching for anyone trying to join us in the Zoom studio, and I haven't seen a notification yet. So all right, and then I posted it in the live chat, but just once again, people tuning in and wondering why you have Chris and I talking, and where is Zack? We got a message probably about an hour and a half ago from Zack saying that he's traveling in New York. They got hung up in traffic, and he's having trouble connecting. So as soon as he can get to a Wi-Fi hotspot, he'll join us. And in the interim, we're kind of tapping into Chris and his knowledge of fashion, and talking about Banyans here. So, hey, another question. What was the range of cost for Banyans? In addition to tailor-made, it's likely used ones were sold.
That's a great question. And I would guess that it would be a huge range, because of course, we very easily forget that in the 18th and 19th century, it was material costs that really drove the cost of any garment. So whereas sort of any journeyman could afford a tailcoat, but it's the material and then sort of the finishing touches that are really driving the cost. So if you look at, if you're having a banyan made out of a very rough linen, or a local wool, right, through to very expensive Chinese silks, right, the range of that fabric can be astronomical. So I wish I didn't have any. I don't have any numbers, but certainly it would be a huge range. And I just wanted to, I don't have very many diagrams from Susan North, but she also published an article, and I'm just going to bring up the title of it here. It was called Indian Gowns and Banyans, New Evidence and Perspectives. And I can't remember the publication that was published in, but this is one of her diagrams, and you can see she's trying to argue as two very parallel. These two garments come from sort of two parallel sources, which is one is more sort of a Far East, almost kimono style garment, as opposed to a more Indian gown. And she argues that the banyan versus the morning gown, that's why we have two distinct garments. And so this is just a diagram showing how those garments were cut, which I find very interesting. Hi, Catherine. Nice to see you again. Women also certainly wore a version of the banyan, again, various names, but it was certainly not acceptable for outside wear. It would be very much a garment to be worn for warmth around the house. So before you're fully dressed for the day, or maybe even you're having your hair styled, or you're doing it yourself, right? Much more in line with what we would think of a house coat as today. And in fact, I think back to my mother, who used to, when she was getting ready for dinner, because she had 4 children, she would get dressed, and then she would put her house coat over top so that um, those children didn't make a mess of her clothes. So sort of a similar idea, right? And warm for warmth, but I've not seen any evidence that women wore them outside the home for any reason. It was very much a home garment.
So we have some great questions in the live chat today. And I'm sorry I don't have a better name other than your YouTube identity, or she did what? Anyways, she's asking, did female tailors also make banyans, or was the garment making divided by gender?
That's a fantastic question. I would, hmm, I would imagine that females went to female tailors to get their dressing gowns, for lack of a better word, made. Um, but yeah, I'm not sure. I can't really imagine a woman going to a male tailor to buy a banyan or to buy a dressing gown. But that's a great question. I just got an update from Zach. This is a minute ago. He said he's just pulling in. So then he, of course, once he's in, he has to get connected on his iPad and that sort of thing. So it should just be a few more minutes. Hopefully the next 5 minutes or so. So I'm seeing Ross. No, Ross, quite the opposite. These garments were worn outside. Certainly, there are people that had their portraits painted in them. They had. There are stories of I mentioned university students wearing them to class. So, a fantastic question. Would officers have taken these on? Would army officers take banyan to Spain? It's hard to say. They did have limitations on what they could carry, but I mean, having a dozen waistcoats was certainly nothing to scoff at for an army officer. So it's probably possible that they would. It's probable that they would have something that they could throw on in the morning. We know that they had undress coats of various styles. So would they be common in an army camp? I don't think so, but certainly not out of place. Now that being said, again, once an officer gets dressed for dinner, no, he's not wearing a banyan anymore. It's certainly, I mean, not wearing them on parade, right? I think there was probably a very clear social line of where these were acceptable, but inside, outside was not the line. I'm just trying to. I finally opened up the live chat, so I've got a lot going on here. Lindsay
I think
Nichols,
we've covered most of them, Chris, but there's the one from Lindsay there, if you want to address that one.
Is there evidence they were made from gowns of that era? So sort of remade from previous garments, I think is kind of what you're getting at. I'm not sure. That's a really neat question. I would suspect that they're, especially the loose, flowier garments, or even the more fitted garment, is a very voluminous garment. I mean, I guess the dresses of the 18th century were as well. So I'm wondering if there would be enough fabric in a gown to be able to turn it into a banyan. I'm not sure. Certainly, they would be made from very similar materials. In the 18th century, there were much wider. I mean, these are not our 18th century gowns are not our white columns of the Regency era. But But yeah, that's a really interesting question. I suspect it would be made of similar materials, but not necessarily cut from old garments, if that makes sense. I've not seen any evidence, but again, love to ask that question of Zack or maybe some of the other tailors. So I see that we're up to 41 people. I will just pause again to say to apologize for Zack. He did get caught in traffic, and he is. We're expecting him momentarily. He's at this point just getting his iPad kind of set up so he can join us. The other thing I should mention is that, I mean, usually we run approximately 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock. Maybe we tend to run over a little bit, but please don't forget this will be entirely recorded on the YouTube channel. So if you aren't able to stay, feel free to come back and pick up where you left off, and we will we'll also do our best to sort of trim down the video a little bit, so when you come back, you can just see the part that you're here for with Zack Pinsent. But yeah, hopefully any minute now.
So good job, Chris, keeping this going, warming the audience up for Zack. Hopefully it's real soon. And then there was a request if we could run a number of these questions by Zack once we have them, and we'll definitely make a point of doing that. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I know Tom often accuses me of hogging the microphone and asking all my questions, my personal questions first, but there have been some fantastic questions here today, so we'll be sure to bring them forward.
All right, how about the one from Anna there? Do you see that one?
Would the fabric indicate the social status of its owner? I would say yes and no to that question. So probably your lower social statuses would likely have banyans made of wool, more for comfort and that sort of thing. But at the same time, your upper classes would probably have a range of fabrics. I know from personal experience that even silk, a nice flowy silk, can be very warm in the summer, but it's also not overly warm in the winter if that's what you need. So I would guess our upper classes would probably have a range of fabrics. They would probably have maybe a quilted warm wool one for wearing around the fire in the winter, but maybe something made out of cotton or even linen for the summer months, and then maybe a fancier silk one, or like me, why not 2 or 3, right?
So Chris, well, we're expecting Zack momentarily. Could we maybe see the rest of the pictures you have here?
Yes, so I'm not sure if I so this is an older style, but you can see the very loose kind of flowy garment there. Arms are still a little bit fitted, but you can see it's very different from the fitted button garment. That one I think I've already shown.
Yep.
This one I love the fabric. I find it a little unfortunate because I think it's the mannequin doesn't quite do it justice here, but I think this is supposed to be a more fitted garment. And this one I love. It is, let me zoom in a bit. This one is quilted. You can see the quilting there. And it's, this is very much, to my eye, is more of an Asian style cut. But I just love the closure there as well. It closes right across the front. So this one, although quilted more for warmth, still is very, very nice style. There are my 3 friends again. Oop, I didn't want to do that.
You got.
So this is a fun challenge because the screen sharing button is over my sort of toggle. So I think I've shown those ones. So those are sort of the ones that I was able to pull up very quickly. There are, I would say, dozens, if not hundreds, of surviving banyans and morning gowns. I've seen probably at least 3 or 4 in tartan material, which is was obviously quite popular. And so sort of a range of materials and fabrics and styles. And so if you are making your own banyan, you know, the sky's the limit. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. And I don't know if people can see. These are the 2 that I've made myself. I'll probably have to turn off my background. So these are the 2 I've made myself. So this is the more fitted style. You can see it's double-breasted, and it's a striped silk. And then this is, you can see the other style, right? Very loose, flowing. It just closes at the front with a couple hooks and eyes, but it doesn't even need to do that. And just absolutely love this silk. It's a double-sided silk, so it's this is actually one piece of fabric. It's not. This is not a lining. So 2 styles of banyan there that I've made, or sorry, one banyan and one morning gown. Yeah, so I'm just seeing Anna, I think it's Anna, yeah, saying that it was considered bad to wear the nightcap with the banyan. Yeah, as we, there is our wandering hero. He has returned, our prodigal son.
It has been such a ramble to sort of get where we were meant to go. We just hit traffic, and a journey that would have taken normally about an hour or so ended up taking like nearly 3. So less than fortuitous. But admittedly, that's very Regency and 18th century, effectively, where journeys just take a turn.
Well, we have been having a fantastic conversation on banyans. There are the chat here has some wonderful questions.
Oh, wonderful!
So I hope you came ready, because they are ready to fire at you. I don't know if you want to talk as a Q&A, or if you want to start, and we'll jump in.
Well, actually, we might as well, seeing as there are already questions, we might as well start on that anyway.
So I'll read the questions off. I think that's a good plan, and then we can bring forward our own questions or carry on the conversation from there. So this is an American question. So they talk about Western Pennsylvania, which would be the frontier. You know, would you have seen people wearing banyans there, especially the small middle class?
Well, certainly. So this is something which, in fact, I've been talking a lot with some friends of mine at Colonial Williamsburg, in the fact that the frontiers were the frontier. They were a bit out of touch, but also you've got to remember that the frontier in Pennsylvania and all of that, you've got to think that's sort of the mid 18th century. Banyans and dressing robes have been a thing since the late 17th century. So they were about an unknown piece of a gentleman's wardrobe by that time anyway. So by the time you sort of get to the middle of the 18th century or into the Regency period, they're a very much more accustomed piece of menswear, and also quite practical, as in it's something that you can wear around the house, but also you can still entertain guests wearing it. But it allows you to have something else to wear than your main coat.
So then a question around class or social status, you know, were they worn by all classes, or was it something more the domain of the wealthy?
So to put it in its context, if you were the sort of person that would have a banyan and that you would then be wearing and entertaining wearing it, you'd obviously have a bit of, you know, cash going on. but it's also that notion of comfort. If you wanted something else to wear. But then again, class structure seems to be a thing where if you wanted to put yourself into debt to a tailor, you certainly could do. And there are all sorts of accounts of that, where sort of lords and ladies might not be spending much at a tailor and aren't in debt at all. And then you've got like, a journeyman bookbinder who's hugely in debt to his tailor because he wants to dress fancy and hopes that one day he'll pay it all off. So it's really about, in terms of class distinction, I'd say it is certainly more of the realm in terms of what we expect with a sumptuous sort of banyan, which would be like a silk or some kind of jacquard linsey woolsey. You've got that as more of the purview of the upper middle class and into the upper classes, and there really necessarily might not be the same sort of call for it as a formal garment in the sort of lower classes. However, it wouldn't be out of the realm possibly that they may have some sort of robe they can wear around, is more akin to a dressing gown in contrast to a banyan sort of thing.
Okay, question around cost. What's the range of cost of banyans in addition to tailor-made? Was it likely that used ones were sold?
There is a roaring second-hand trade in the 18th and 19th centuries. In fact, there's even a second-hand industry in the selling of wigs, which is particularly interesting. So anything that would be sold on in some format. Now, banyan's in a much more sumptuous fabric. You've got to remember that that's a fair amount of good fabric. So that would probably be kept or altered or turned into something else a lot of the time, because you're getting a nice amount of yardage, and you could potentially have that chopped down into a Regency day dress for a woman or sets of small clothes and things like that. You would then probably go, well, the banyan's out of fashion, or it's threadbare here, or it belonged to my dad who's passed, we want to make something out of it. Would be an option, or also just selling on things. So yes, you could certainly have secondhand banyans, and in fact, there's one in a friend of mine's collection where the fabric of the banyan is from the 1720s or 30s, but the cut and style of it is of the 1820s and 30s. So it was fabric that was used probably in a robe volant and then chopped down and used for a banyan. So it's quite interesting to see that progression, and who knows, maybe the same was in effect for a gentleman's banyan.
All right. Tailoring, was it gender specific? Men tailors for gentlemen, women tailors for women, or did the genders cross?
So you have tailors generally for gentlemen, and then you have mantua makers, and they make ladies' garments. But also tailors would make women's garments that would be made from wool, so riding habits and pelisses. Spencers, however, because they're using less wool, because at one point there was a law or saying that women mantua makers couldn't cut cloth, as in woolen cloth, of more than a yard, which therefore meant that everything else had to then be done and made by tailors, where the molding and the art of tailoring was really down to their own sort of realm of craft, as it were, which is particularly interesting. But then for women would have sort of robe à la chambre, or sort of, quite literally a dressing gown. But also there was the different expectation with women. Women had a whole different set of clothing and ritual. They had morning dress and retiring dress and all these sorts of levels and layers of dressing. Rather than with gentlemen, it was basically a case of you're either dressed or you're undressed. So then the banyan is that really interesting and quite useful bridge between the two.
All right. There was a question from Lindsay. I think you covered that when you talked about the used clothing market. Bear with me.
Oh, not at all.
So would the fabric indicate the social status of the owner?
Generally speaking, yes. And there are two sort of ways you can look at this. Fabric will always have an inherent value, something which we don't really fully recognize now. And interestingly, you have that notion where you look at the cut and style of something and opposed to the fabric. So, for example, with the 1830s one made from the 1740s fabric, it's that thing of going, well, the fabric had an inherent cost and an inherent value to it. So, therefore, you've got to think, oh, so was that person buying it vintage, or was it something they had in the family? So, generally, you then got to think a lovely silken banyan, especially, that's generally going to be a high class sort of garment, a much more wealthy thing, because the fabric was still of a high value. And then you have pieces which may be more mass produced. So some printed cotton, some printed linens, which may, not quite incur the same sorts of expenses. But generally it was the purview of gentlemen, bachelors, husbands, that sort of thing, a very sort of middle class and higher sort of garment. And generally speaking, when a banyan is sort of found, there's always some kind of story or connection along with it, generally speaking, or some just sort of pop up in a collection with no backstory whatsoever. And that can be this sort of the real trial of trying to find a way to sort of piece together where something might have come from.
All right. Last one, and I think you're caught up. Welcome to the call. We asked you to do a full sprint right away without warming up.
Not at all. Absolute pleasure.
All right. So Anna said, she's read somewhere that a banyan was sometimes worn for warmth in a drafty country house, would go with a house cap. Is it considered bad form to wear a nightcap with the banyan?
Not at all. So you've got to think of the context in which you're wearing it. So if you're at home and it's cold, you're going to wear everything you're going to want to wear to keep warm. So that's perfectly acceptable. At home by yourself or with your family, not a problem. However, the flip side is if you were entertaining people, it wouldn't really be that seemly to necessarily be wearing your nightcap. But I'm sure it was done by some people, I'm sure, but it wasn't necessarily the form to do so.
All right, Chris, this is time to unleash you. Do you have questions?
Oh boy, do I. So one of the things I was trying to, not entirely successfully, do it, and I'm glad you mentioned, by the way, the tailors at Fort York, because I started out by saying the vast majority of things I know about banyans come from conversations with Mike McCarthy, and he really started a lot of my wonderings about banyans. But I was wondering if you could talk in more detail, or maybe clarify what I was trying to say about the difference between a banyan and a morning gown or a wrapping gown, sort of as we see in the 18th century and into the 19th century.
Yes, of course. Well, currently I'm wearing a wrapping gown, or sometimes referred to as a tea gown, as in the letter T, as opposed to the later Victorian female tea gown, simply due to the way it is constructed. So from the offset, banyans come over as a form of robe, very much inspired by Japanese kimono, but along also with opening up into Turkey with Albanian dress, basically that notion of wearing a robe, in that sort of fashion coming into play. And it starts off with being exotic and interesting, and people sort of wearing them very much as loose wrap-about gowns. And a banyan really comes into play when it's, when it forms itself as a more fitted garment. That for me is really when the flip happens. So colloquially, I will refer to, simply for the ease of everyone, I'll refer to them all as a banyan. But to be technical, this is a wrapping gown, and then a banyan is a more fitted garment. Well, I think the real clincher of it is when the sleeves become a separate thing that are then sewn on, as opposed to the sleeves are incorporated into the patterning of the outfit, which doesn't appear in Western clothing tradition really at all. And it's really very much a, more of a Middle Eastern and Asian clothing attribute in order to do that. So those sorts of clothing practices were then taken on, and interestingly, it potentially informs the way in which some mantua makers make certain gowns. So for example, some court mantuas and things, which you'll see in the new School of Historical Dress book, Patterns of Fashion. The way in which gowns can sort of be laid out and basically cut in particular ways. So there is that whole notion of cutting things out in a much more flat way, rather than, see, this is one of the big differences between dressmakers and tailors in terms of how things are sort of made and put together. So it's a particularly interesting sort of field of study and working out sort of which came first, chicken or the egg sort of situation. Yeah.
So further to that, and again, in conversations with Colonial Williamsburg, they're very, very much a sort of late 18th century, of course. But as we shift into the Regency era, do you think we would see more of the banyan style and less of the wrapping gown, or do you think it continued to be like, I'm wondering if the wrapping gown style became sort of an older version, that's what my father wears, I need something new, or do you think they continued in parallel throughout the Regency era?
You do see a bit of both. However, I think it would be more, from quite literally what I've seen and when things are dated to and everything, there really is that change when you get into the Regency Federalist period, where they are going for the tighter fit, the closer look, because after all, that is the fashion of the day anyway. Now, it doesn't mean that it's tight fitted like the 20s and 30s with a proper waist and everything, but there's a bit more form happening to it. But you're not necessarily getting rid of some of the looseness. So the sleeves are a little looser, the skirts are a bit looser, but it's not the same kind of construction as is the sort of typical wrapping gown that we see, which is hugely popular in the 18th century. And you've seen a lot of portraits as well, especially gentlemen who were philosophers or artists. It was that interesting notion to sort of let loose and be relaxed. And this was another way of them showing that they were interesting but could relax at the same time. It sort of became a catch-22 between sort of to let loose your thoughts, you had to dress loosely as well. It was a sort of a very clumsy metaphor.
I love it, but that's a really nice segue into one of the other things I was hoping we could talk about is there's very much this notion in the 21st century that a banyan or a wrapping gown are equivalent to a house coat that we would wear today, right? So you put it on when you get out of the shower and then you get dressed. And it's not a garment for outside wear, it's not a garment for receiving guests. But the fact that so many people were painted in portraits suggests that it's not. So I'm wondering if you can help us with where is the line there? What is it acceptable to do while wearing a banyan?
Well, so interestingly, I often try to say, oh, it's a bit like a smoking jacket, it's a bit like a dressing gown. There really isn't a modern equivalent, because this is a garment which you could have at leisure at home and you'd receive guests wearing it because it's an expensive enough material, it covers everything it needs to do. You're still wearing a waistcoat and breeches, or not always. Sometimes you could just be wearing breeches, but that depends on climate. So if you think an Englishman, for example, he's in his London house, he's receiving some guests who are friends or business acquaintances, he's very much going to remain at home. So he's got his banyan on and his waistcoat and everything, and he can do business that way, and that's not a problem. You don't really see it worn out, except in the London Gazette in, I think, 1782, there's some gentlemen that decide to go about Hyde Park wearing their banyans with their hats, their canes, and their swords to show off these expensive silken garments, which no one else really ever gets to see. And it caused a bit of a scandal, and people going, oh, it's shocking behavior because these men weren't properly dressed. And I think that's really quite quaint. Especially when you think of sort of what some people go out in now, in effectively their dressing gowns. But there's also the interesting thing where, for example, if you're at a gentleman's club and you were staying in the gentleman's club, you could almost use that as your own home, and it would be fine for you to walk around wearing a banyan. So there are particular situations where it's completely acceptable. Or if you're staying at a friend's house or something, you could then slip into your banyan and everything, depending on close comfort and things like that. In the same way as it's on a similar level into it, it's just that thing of politeness of when you go into someone's home, do you take your shoes off or not? You know, it's like, I'm going to this person's house. Ooh, is it a banyan house, or should I be properly dressed? You know, like, how well do I know them? Can I rock around wearing this hoodie, or do I have to like be a bit more put together? So that's very much sort of a good way of putting that together, I think.
Now, I suspect this will be purely speculation on your part, but I wonder if part of that that line would be blurred when we're talking about a banyan versus a wrapping gown, or even a level of material. So earlier I was talking about sort of, you know, yes, there are the sort of the fine silks and, you know, lovely banyans that are, you know, embroidered or lovely done, but then there's also a wool, you know, padded banyan that is worn purely for warmth. And then I wonder too, right, if one would be socially acceptable in your friend's house and another not so much.
I think that it comes down to context. For example, if you were a gentleman in Sweden, for example, and your house is freezing, but you're still doing business at home, you could still wear your lovely padded, warm banyan, because your gentleman friends that are coming to do business will probably continue wearing their house, you know, continue wearing their outside coat on top of everything, depending on how warm it is. So it is very much a contextual thing. So in the same way in which you have in Virginia, for example, you do have gentlemen going around wearing their thin printed cotton banyans over a shirt and breeches, because it is so stiflingly hot. So people sort of, it becomes a collective thing of everyone going, okay, some things are allowed to go by the board. And I think that's one of the things that really help attest to the sheer practicality of the 18th century, which often gets overlooked because we go, oh, they did this, they did that, that seems so complicated, or that seems so over the top. And it's going, well, no, they're actually very, very practical. It's just in a very different way to what you're used to. And the fact that context is really key. And there's very few really clothing you know, statements you can make which sweep over everything. You know, you can say that a gentleman should have a white shirt. That's kind of like the only thing you can kind of pick at in terms of a contextual, you know, sweeping statement that fits everyone. Because you know, you could have your nice woolen, perhaps patterned woolen banyan to keep you warm and everything, as in keeping you nice and cozy in the winter. But it would still also be acceptable to wear that at home. After all, if you're receiving guests, they're coming into your home. And I think it depends on rank as well. So, for example, if you had people of business coming over and they were doing business for you, you could wear your banyan. But if you had people coming over, like lawyers or something, who were of a higher rank than you were and they were helping you out, you'd probably get properly dressed. Or if you had, you know, it's that thing of, if someone of a higher rank of you is coming along, it's always a safer bet to dress appropriately. You know, you don't want to do what Thomas Jefferson did and wear a banyan and insult the British equerry no, plenipotentiary, and cause a bit of an international scandal, because he came in his full court suit and everything and was read as arriving and everything, and Thomas Jefferson opens the door himself in his banyan, and it's like, what like formality, like, you know, his head explodes in and I just think it's delightful.
I have to say that I don't know what it is in England still today, but I find that in Canada, I'll speak for our American friends in North America, the distinctions of rank are some of the things for us that are the hardest to understand, looking back at the Regency era and going,
Yeah.
well, wait a minute, why didn't he talk to her? Oh, because, you know, this has to be reserved and this has to be, and I mean, even reading Jane Austen and going, oh, now somebody told me that, you know, this is a huge social blunder, but we didn't know that because you know, that's just a piece of context that it's so hard for us.
And everything is so built around not just hierarchy, but polite civility. So in that same way of, you know, a friend request on Facebook, you know, you go, do you know this person? It's like, oh yeah, they're so and so. Oh right, fine, accept. So it's that thing of, it's much nicer to be, you know, because after all, letters of introduction are a thing, because it's the 18th century, it's the Regency. You can't just Google someone to make sure that they are who they say they are. So it's a continual vouching for system, because you can't just check who someone is. You can't call up a branch of that London bank and go, hi, do they actually work for you? Because they came over and they did this. So that's part of it. It's part of sort of making everyone honest, and sort of making sure everyone is who they say they are, because they might very well not be. Which is how you have confidence tricksters in such a way, because you could say, oh, I'm a friend of your cousin so-and-so in Bath. And it's like, yeah, but how have I not heard of you? Normally they'd write saying, oh, you might meet Mr. So-and-so, who's a friend of mine. There was this whole thing of, which is why you required letters of introduction or to be introduced to someone. You know, we go, oh, it seems silly, but actually someone could just be lying or trying to take advantage of you. So in a way, it's quite a good system, especially as where nowadays it's that thing of, we'll look at someone on social media, make sure they're genuine sort of thing, but that can all be faked. So we still really stick to the word of mouth, and to be introduced to someone can mean a lot more. That's why networking is so important. And that's why it doesn't matter what you're doing on social media or whatnot. You need to have, quite literally, a reputation to back up what you do.
Yeah, excellent point. Just to steer back to Banyans a little bit, this is a very niche question. I'm wondering if there is, I've not come across any evidence of British Army officers talking about taking either wrapping gowns or morning gowns on campaign with them. And I was sort of saying, when somebody was asking, you know, there's a dozen waistcoats, or, you know, 3 or 4 coats, right? We have lists of what officers took, and, you know, 24 shirts is sort of nothing unreasonable. So I'm just wondering, like, it seems like it would be a very practical garment for getting up in the morning and throwing on, and before you shave, or that sort of thing. Do you have any evidence that this is something that we would see in a camp or on campaign in Spain or North America?
It seems to be that thing of, if you're in camp, you're kind of expected to be more in uniform. Now, if you're in barracks, that changes things slightly, I'd say. But I have, like, in my head, I've got a couple of images. One is in barracks, and I think one is maybe in a tent. And they are wearing sort of gowns, effectively. But it's also that notion of the officer class is obviously separate to the men, but you don't want to overstate that difference, which is why Wellington famously kind of said to his officers whilst in the Peninsula campaign, you know, he sent around a memo basically saying, you know, stop using parasols and fans, because you're already on a horse. You're not having to walk like the men. You've got a hat. Like, stick with it. Basically, you don't need a parasol and a fan. But it's quite nice to know that officers were using parasols and fans, because they're practical things after all. We look at them now as incredibly gendered, which they really weren't. You had very ornate fans and everything for ladies, but you had men with sort of simple fans, sort of thing. So the notion of gender is interesting. But in terms of a gentleman on campaign, it's also down to the individual. So you have some where they'll travel with an entire library of books. And then you have some who will travel with an entire string quartet worth of instruments. So it's very much down to the type of officer they are, the rank they hold, the personal money they may have. Because just to be an officer doesn't necessarily mean you have money. you have to admittedly purchase your commission, but that could be a sponsored commission. And then you then have to keep that up. And, you know, people can continually go into debt because of that. And then you have, and it becomes a really interesting system. And I think at one point, that there were several officers who were away on campaign, but they kept sort of writing checks back for their, you know, oh, put a draft through to my banks in London. They're massively in debt, so they have an immediate arrest warrant for debt as soon as they land. which the same thing happened to naval officers and people who sort of fled the country. You know, it would kind of be known that you were about and you were coming back. You know, which is why people ended up at sponging houses and the Marshalsea and things like that, arrested for debt. And it was kind of it was a shameful thing, but also that thing of, oh, isn't this funny? You were arrested for debt. It was seen as, oh, they're worrying about money. You know, it was a very interesting, very privileged sort of set of people. But it, you know, and then you have people going, well, okay, I'm a penniless officer. I've got all this glory hanging over me from the campaigns I've been on and everything, but I haven't got any liquid money, so I need to marry a rich woman. So, and then that enters the whole marriage market of people then social climbing. So once again, money is the thing that makes the world go round. But so it's money and reputation, which somehow helps with Banyans in camp.
All right. So I got a couple more questions that's popped in here. So I'm going to take that as we had one of our colleagues, Ross, was questioning our wearing banyans around camp. So I'm saying that there isn't a definitive answer, and we're fine wearing that, especially in the comforts of our own tents. So
it seems very much something which I would keep confined to the mess and your tents, because after all, you're officers on duty. So to exit your tent is you're effectively on parade. Now, if you're in barracks, I think that's a different kettle of fish. Or if, yeah,
actually, duty is more designated by the wearing of a sash and a sword, right? You can be in civilian clothes in camp and
oh no.
So yeah. All right. So Catherine asks, how late into the 19th century did the banyan remain in use, and then what garment replaced it?
Well, interestingly, it just evolves. So it doesn't really, there isn't a day where they go, it disappears. But the 30s and the 1820s and 30s are really when it becomes, you know, a wasp waist type thing. But then that doesn't really stop that either. It basically turns into the dressing gown and the house coat. And then you have in the Victorian period, you know, very nice house coats, you know, interesting paisley designs and such. And then really once you get into the, you know, late Victorian, Edwardian period, you then have the dressing gowns, which are literally, I've come out of the shower type sort of dressing gowns. And they, and then there's the difference between that and the smoking jacket. So the smoking jacket kind of replaces the banyan, but not quite in the same way. So it's informal, but where you can wear like a velvet smoking jacket or something now on the red carpet or something, you wouldn't have been able to do that with a banyan in a similar situation, if that makes any sense. But then again, we live in a time now where clothing and formality has done a complete sort of flip around, which is really interesting. So I think, which is why it's particularly difficult to put a modern perspective or draw a modern equivalent. But I think very much it was wrapping gown through to banyan, through to sort of house coat and dressing gown, and then into sort of smoking jacket territory.
All right, we're back to this question around tailors and seamstresses. Were women ever designated as tailors, or were they always relegated to the lower status designation of seamstress?
It wasn't so much a thing of the term being higher or lower. So tailoring was a trade, but also a mantua maker was a trade, just as highly prized. So you have these amazing court gowns or cloth of silver, cloth of gold gowns and things, where they will show, and put together these amazing gowns of far more value or equal value or something the of the gowns and things which the gentleman would have. So a gentleman's suit would cost more or maybe less of than a lady's gown. So it's not so much that, because it's about what you can kind of demand. But in terms of skill level, it's just very different sets of skills. I don't know of any cases where there has been a woman referred to as a tailor, but there may well have been. But it was and kind of is, unfortunately, still a very male-dominated profession, because after all, you're working with men and fitting men. So it's that notion of that civility sort of thing, where you wouldn't expect a gentleman to be fitting a woman except for like a riding habit, because that's a manly pursuit sort of thing, in their mind. But to then have a woman fitting a man for a suit, that wouldn't really work in terms of society. But is that necessarily stopping people all over the place or in different places making something for people? I'm not so sure. After all, you have women making their husbands' wedding waistcoats, for example. But I think that's more of a domestic side of things. And the art of tailoring was really a full profession. And unfortunately, because of the sexism of the past, women weren't allowed to be part of it, unfortunately. But that doesn't necessarily stop someone doing the same sort of job, but they wouldn't have the same, plaudits because of it.
All right. Zach, are you all right going another 10, 15 minutes? And then
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. All right, good. So people, we still have a good number still watching. That's great for hanging in with us. Get your questions in. And then before Chris jumps back on, I'm going to have a question, and I'll admit to be a real layman when it comes to fashion, but I got the sense that women's fashion was kind of influenced by the continent, or more particularly Paris. They would kind of define the season, what the dresses would look like. Was there equivalent for men's clothing? And if so, then what influenced the fashion associated with banyans or dressing gowns?
I think one of the main things that influences men's fashion is adventure and campaign. So the art of discovery, of finding new places. So, for example, you have Lord Byron wearing his Albanian costume, and you have men then wearing sort of these turban type styles for particular parties and things. It's the look of the exotic. So suddenly you have men wearing, waistcoats embroidered with palm trees and things. So there's that notion of we explore, we're gentlemen, we can explore and go places. But with women, certainly things are referenced sort of by the continent, but also there are sort of stalwart English fashions. And you think by the early 19th century, especially, a lot of fashion for men is coming from English hunting fashion, effectively, which is why we pretty much moved from the Georgian frock coat style to the sort of more Regency tailcoat style. And the 19th century, up until from sort of the 1790s, 1800 or so, it basically becomes a camp of, are you Napoleonic or are you allies? And the two don't really mix officially, but there are points at which they do coalesce and collide, because fashion was sort of above war, as it were. There was still the movement of fashion plates and fashion dolls of both men and women, seeing what was fashionable on either side of the continent. But I think for men, it really is that thing of, it's also that patriotic thing of, I need to have a more English style because my friends are officers, they're on campaign, I need to be very English in my style. And then the French are going, well, this is the fashion of the Hussars or of this particular regiment or something, so I'm going to try and emulate that in some sort of way, and to sort of, beef up their image, really, to be more in line with a patriotic style.
All right, a question popped into the chat from Pamela, more personal one. Zach, how many banyans or dressing gowns do you own?
So, good point. four. I've got four. So the first one that I made, I now know is completely wrong. And I made that a more sort of 1820s, 1830s style, from a really nice sort of dragonfly black silk thing. Very kind of fanciful. Not the sort of thing I do now. And then I've got this one, which is of course my main go-to one, which is a lovely silk with a cotton lining and then a padded cotton interior. So it's actually got some nice padding to it. I've recently made a printed cotton one, which is perfect for summer. You just put it on over anything and it's nice and flowy. And then I've got another one which is much more 18th century, double-breasted, striped with a printed cotton floral interior, but then with so it's all padded. So it's like wearing a socially acceptable duvet.
All right, I'll turn it back to Chris.
Are those all, so they're also, excuse me, are those all wrapping gowns, or is one of them a banyan?
No. So this is actually the only wrapping gown I have. Well, so this one's a wrapping gown, and the printed cotton one that I made for summer and everything is very much a wrapping gown as well. But I did some pleating in the back, which I'd seen on, it was kind of an experimental piece as well, but very much the base of a wrapping gown. And then the other ones are formal banyans, where there are separate sleeves, a body and a back. And I think that's what really formulates a banyan, and the fact that it's made very similarly or very much like a coat with other pieces, rather than I think a wrapping gown is very much, here's a shape, let's use the material.
So do you think you could stand up and
give
us a little?
Yeah, good point.
Give us a little turn.
So this shows you a bit of the let's see. Okay, so this shows you the sort of style of it. It's very sort of T-shaped. So there's only really sort of one seam down here, but then to add extra flair, you can add other panels. It depends on the width of your fabric, but yeah, it just wraps around, wrapping gown.
So a banyan would be literally cut like a coat with a back piece, you know, a narrow back, and then.
So the same amount of pieces as a coat would have, but with a bit more sort of flair and cut a bit more generously, and of course being longer and made of whatever material you wanted, really. But interestingly, that I was in Germany, in Württemberg, and there was this green silk court uniform, court coat. So it was all the embroidery and everything, but it had this wool padding on the inside and then silk, but then it was pad stitched the whole way through. So the whole thing was basically a formal banyan. So it was that thing of, how do you keep warm in these drafty German castles and things? Well, I've got to attend court and I really feel the cold, but I can't put a coat on or anything. I have to wear this formal attire. So what do? I'm going to pad out my coat, breeches, and waistcoat. And I think that's a fantastic thing to do.
And maybe on that note, you could mention, we haven't really talked about the idea of an integral waistcoat, which was, again, I think more of an 18th century thing, if I'm not wrong, but it was fairly common.
Yeah, you see it more in the 18th century, but I have seen some 19th century sort of Regency ones where there is the waistcoat, and the waistcoat is what sort of does it up, and then you can do that on top. And the waistcoat generally can also unbutton itself. So there are some which are very loose, but you can. It's a really interesting cheat, which I think is interesting, because what I've looked at is a very structured. Late 18 teens, where it's got a nice short bodice to it, and it's got the waistcoat as part of it, but the waistcoat is attached to the banyan with some buttons, so you can take that off if you want it to be looser, and you can sort of close things up. So it gives you options. It makes the whole process really, really versatile.
That's fascinating. We've got another question from Anna, and I have to mention that before you jumped on, I recommended an article by Susan North,
Oh,
I'm sure you know it, but I couldn't remember the publication. I don't know if you know it off the top of your head, but
oh,
um,
I
it did remind me of the sort
yeah.
of Anna's
I
question.
found I put a link to that in the chat, Chris. I think it was from University of Edinburgh Press or something
Yeah,
like
yeah, I
that.
was going to say it's one of the university presses.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. So Anna's question is, the cut of the banyan reminds me of the Japanese kimono. Would this mean that the Dutch East India Company brought the banyan to the Western world?
Um, I'd say that's a bit too simplistic. Um, there was no sort of one thing. It was that thing of everyone was kind of exploring at the same time, but also it doesn't just take inspiration from the kimono. It has a lot of heavy influence from the kimono, but also from robes worn by tradesmen in the ports in India, which is why it's called a banyan, because that is a Indian word, well, a Hindi word originally, but it's been anglicized, and it basically means a trader or merchant, and it's kind of the things they wore between running in and out of their homes and things. And I find that really, really interesting. But you know, and some people said, "Oh, it's because of the banyan tree." It's like, no, that's a weird English kind of misunderstanding of sort of what's going on, rather than anything else. So I think it'd be too simplistic to say it's the Dutch that did it. However, I think it's a safe bet to say that it was far more popularized then because of that. Because then, of course, you have other examples of kimonos coming over, and then people going, "Oh, I quite like that. I'd like to do something like that, but I can't wear the exact same thing because our society is more advanced than theirs. So I need to now adapt it." That was the Western thinking. We can appreciate these things from other cultures, but we can't do the exact same thing because we're better. Um, Obviously not the case, but it's interesting to see how they move around that of going, we love this, but we don't love it that much because we do everything far better than they do. So it's an interesting piece of colonialism, effectively.
Lisa is asking, I'm not sure exactly what she's referring to, but she's asking you to talk about Handel's banyan.
Ah, yes. So I was lucky enough, the Handel and Hendricks Museum in London asked me to make a banyan. For Handel. So Handel is seen in the same banyan in several portraits and writings, and in fact on his marble bust. Now, what's interesting is that I worked out that that particular closure he's using on his banyan robe is a Turkish sort of style of cut across and everything. So they asked me if I could sort of make one, and I was like, I'll give it a go. And it was quite interesting to do it because it's a really useful piece for the museum because it gives some idea of the scale of Handel. Because we go Handel and we kind of think of a portrait we might have seen, but to then put it in the scale of this was a large man. He was over 6 feet tall. He was a broad man. And he had a great big wig as well, huge feet, and a very deep, very broad German accent. He was an intimidating figure, considering the average height of people was about 5'7" at the time and lower. So for like a 6'2", 6'3" tall German man, broad chested, it gives you a better idea of the imposing figure that was Friedrich Handel. And it involved lots of research in terms of looking at all the portraits and trying to see if there was something similar left, and there wasn't. And it was then looking at how it was depicted in certain ways, and then what material would be appropriate, but not just appropriate, what would be the easiest thing to have on display from a conservator point of view. So we did talk about doing velvet because we looked at a few of them and thought, well, it's probably a velvet. But then it became the problem of cleaning and maintaining a piece on display in the center of London with all the dust around velvet and everything, because they didn't want to have it in a case. So it had to be a movable thing. So I was like, okay, we can sort of go for something. So we went for a really nice silk satin, which it could still have been, because obviously he had more than one of these made because of the length of time in which he was depicted wearing them. And then I obviously made the buttons, and a friend of mine wove the decorative tapes that go along with the buttons themselves. but it's a really fun, interesting construction because it's actually lots of sort of square plackets that fold over one another to form the front, which is just I've never really seen anything like it until I started looking at that, and then I start to see it pop up in other places. Once you start looking for something, you do occasionally then see it start popping up.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm gonna, Tom, if it's okay, say one more question from
Sure.
Catherine. So she's asking, so a few of the examples I showed were, I believe, Colonial Williamsburg, and there's sort of a brilliant yellow one, which I'm sure
Oh
you've seen.
yes, yeah, I know the yellow.
And she said there was a red one as well, and so she's asking about class distinctions in terms of color. So would it be the purview just of sort of certain classes to wear these brighter colors, or was it more mixed?
It's more about what can you afford. So if that particular shade of yellow, it begins with a C. It's not cardamom yellow, cambric yellow. It'll come to me, but that is the new shade. That is highly fashionable. So therefore, it's going to be really expensive. So it just depends on what's fashionable, what's in demand. So you could have a really brightly dyed piece of silk or linen or cotton for your own outfit or banyan, but it would just be like of a lesser grade, a lesser cloth. So you could still wear something that Lord of the Manor might wear, but it would be of a different grade. So you could wear, instead of using something dyed with scarlet, it would be something dyed with madder instead, and it would be less dye stable, and it might not look quite the same, and it might have more slubs in it than that lovely, more expensive silk. So it's simply more about what you can afford and what you want to spend on it as well. So you could be Lord of the Manor, lots of money, but you might just not really be a fashionable person, and you'll just send off to your tailors maybe saying, I want a banyan like to have and to wear, a house coat. And then it might be down to the discretion of your tailor then, like how much do they want to charge you, and do they know your tastes? But it's also that thing of it could be delivered and you could say, oh, I don't like that, and then send it back, and then it would be sold on to someone else or something. So I think it really is that notion of, it depends how interested you were in your banyan, and also what you wanted to spend on it, and what you wanted to convey in it. So for example, if you were a young bon ton about town and you'd be receiving friends and guests and things, you would like something to show off in, because they've all come in wearing the same kind of tailcoats and things, from walking about town or visiting people. They're maybe a bit more darkly dressed. They come into you to see you for maybe a glass of wine or something, and there you are in your bright golden yellow banyan, in your drawing room. That's going to make quite an impression.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we've answered all the questions, but I will say Zack is hugely receptive to conversations on social media. So if there's anything we've missed here, please please look him up on probably Instagram is the most common one now, Zack, I would guess, but he's also, you're on YouTube, right? You've got you post some videos there. He's everywhere. So feel free to message him if we've missed anything. And Zack, I will say thank you. We are very glad that we did get you on eventually.
Thank you so much for bearing with me there. It was kind of like, yeah, one of those days.
I'm going to turn it back over to Tom.
Perfect. Yes, really appreciate everyone sticking with us for a little bit longer. And thank you, Chris, for holding down the fort until Zack could join us. And Zack, thank you. I know it was quite a scramble for you to get to a hotspot and connect with your Wi-Fi. And
no problem.
I miss the ambiance of your room and the other recordings. Which the other times we go down that very much looks like a hotel room. So
I'm afraid so. But we can talk after this and see if we want to set up something else as well whilst I'm in the States. Who knows?
All right, we have Kay saying the yellow. Maybe it's Dyer's chamomile.
No, it's not the chamomile, but it'll bother me. But once I find it out, I'll let you all know.
All right, appreciate that. Well, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you joining us. There's also 2 other videos by Zack on our YouTube channel. You can look those up there. So maybe we'll have to put a collection together of the Zack collection. So, all right.